The Earth is being visited by non-human intelligences. That's the claim of infamous whistleblower David Grush. After a congressional hearing has left the nation and the world at large divided on the issue of UFOs, the topic has received more attention than ever, and disturbingly, a growing number of politicians and academics are calling for greater scrutiny of this strange phenomenon. These are the most credible UFO sightings in history so far. 1952. Operation Mainbrace. UFO concerns in America in the post-war period finally reached the United Kingdom in 1950, with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill asking his Air Minister for a briefing on the topic of flying saucers. He was assured that there was nothing to worry about, and there was no credible evidence that these apparent alien craft were anything more than misidentification, hoaxes, or natural phenomenon. 2 years later, the British Ministry of Defense was forced to take back that statement. In 1952, NATO launched Exercise Mainbrace, a simulated invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet Union. What happened next would prompt Captain Edward Ruppelt, head of the U.S. Air Force Project Blue Book, to comment that this incident finally prompted the RAF to officially recognize the UFO phenomenon. And recognize it they did, with the feverish investigation in the wake of the Mainbrace incidents prompting the CIA's Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence, Dr. H. Marshall Chadwell, to write a classified memo titled British Activity in the Field of UFOs. In fall of 1952, 80,000 NATO personnel took part in a massive 12-day military exercise in waters off the coast of Norway and Denmark. The navies of the United States and the United Kingdom made up the bulk of the international coalition's power, and the exercise was meant as both a show of force to act as a deterrent to the Soviet Union and as a way to practice a response to an invasion of Western Europe by the Soviets. It was the biggest display of naval power in the region since World War I, and all personnel were on the lookout for Soviet surveillance aircraft and ships. But something else decided to come and check the exercise out. It all began on September 13th, when the crew on the Danish destroyer Villamos witnessed a strange triangular-shaped object moving at high speeds across the sky. It seemed to glow with a strange bluish light and was witnessed by the destroyer's captain, who estimated it to be moving at supersonic speeds. A week later, as the exercise progressed, the UFOs returned. On September 19th, a British Meteor fighter jet was returning to its airfield at Topcliffe, Yorkshire, at just prior to 11 a.m. In what would become known within British intelligence as the Yorkshire Incident, a group of senior British military leaders were gathered as the meteor came in for a landing. Suddenly, the men on the ground spotted a silvery disc-like metallic object following the meteor while moving back and forth as it did, swaying like a pendulum. The meteor canceled its landing and began to circle, trying to get a closer look at the object. On the ground, the British officers witnessed the object come to a complete standstill and hover silently, rotating slowly on its axis. When the meteor got too close, the disc suddenly shot off westward at incredible speed, making an abrupt course change and disappearing in the southeastern horizon. Dr. Chadwell would write a CIA memo on the incident, remarking how the object was seen by many high-ranking officials from the Royal Air Force, as well as civilian onlookers, prompting a newspaper to report on the incident, much to the dismay of the RAF. On September 20th, the crew aboard the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt aircraft carrier spotted a silvery spherical object that seemed to be following the fleet. The object was photographed by reporter Wallace Litwin, who took color photographs which were promptly seized by Navy intelligence. The photos were never made public, but Project Blue Book's chief, Captain Ruppelt, would later state that the photos were of excellent quality and clearly showed the object moving rapidly as it approached the fleet. Suspicions that the object was an errant weather balloon were dispelled in the post-incident investigation, with no ship having launched one that day. Later that evening, at Karup Field in Denmark, Danish Air Force officers spotted a shiny metallic disc flying overhead at about 7:30 p.m. The object appeared to be coming from the direction of the fleet out at sea and quickly disappeared into the clouds in the east. On September 21st, Royal Air Force pilots were returning to base and observed a shiny sphere approaching from the direction of the fleet at sea. The 6 aircraft immediately vectored in on the sphere and gave pursuit, with the sphere eluding them and disappearing. As the aircraft returned to base, one of the pilots looked behind them and spotted the sphere following closely behind. He immediately turned to give chase again, but the sphere turned as well and quickly accelerated out of sight. The Mainbrace sightings were never explained and couldn't be chalked up to visual anomalies or weather events, as they were verified by personnel across the NATO alliance. The incident shook the British intelligence services to the core, scaring them enough to reopen an investigation into the UFO phenomenon. A month later, though, another incident much closer to home would rattle the UK military. On October 21, 1952, Flight Lieutenant Michael Swinney, a pilot instructor, was taking his new student, Royal Navy Lieutenant David Crofts, up for a training flight. The jet took off without incident and headed up into a thick cloud bank. As the jet punched through the clouds at an elevation of 15,000 feet, the men got the fright of their lives. Directly ahead of them were three nearly white circular objects. Two were on a level keel with the third slightly on its side. Swinney's first instinct was to grab control of the jet and bank away, believing that they were heading straight for three men parachuting down. As they leveled out, though, the two aviators got a clear look at what exactly had been waiting for them. In an interview, Swinney described the objects as the typically reported saucers, but mentioned that as they climbed above them, they realized that they were very flat. The craft were hovering perfectly still, but when the meteor flew above them, they moved from one side of the plane to the other in a rapid, sudden movement. Leveling out at 35,000 feet, Swinney and Crofts looked down at the craft from above, noting that the craft seemed to give off a slightly fuzzy or iridescent light along the edges. The craft appeared to be completely solid, with no windows, portholes, or any visible signs of propulsion. Swinney was so disturbed by the sighting that he checked to make sure his oxygen was flowing correctly, even asking Crofts to verify that the oxygen system was indeed working. Crofts, who would verify Swinney's story decades later, commented on Swinney's disbelief at what he was seeing. Crofts suggested that they go after the UFOs as they began to move away. However, Swinney shot the idea down, remarking on an incident reported from the west coast of the US where two pilots went after a UFO and disappeared, with the rumor being that they were vaporized by the object they were chasing. Swinney planned to cancel the exercise and return to base, but radioed his sighting in before doing so. The radio call caused pandemonium on the ground, as most personnel had heard rumors of UFOs but disregarded the phenomenon. The fact that one of their own instructors was calling in a sighting, however, rattled the crew on the ground, with air traffic control ordering Swinney to approach the UFOs to get a better look. Reluctantly, Swinney turned his meteor toward the craft, accelerating to Mach 0.8. As the meteor neared the craft, though, they appeared to simply disappear. Swinney and Crofts both commented that as they approached, they would look at the craft to keep themselves oriented and then look away to clear their vision. Upon looking back, though, the objects had simply disappeared. Altogether, though, Swinney and Crofts had kept the objects under observation for 10 minutes. What the two pilots couldn't know, though, is that miles away, the UFOs were causing even more panic within the RAF. Unbeknownst to the pilots, the UFOs had been tracked on radar at Little Rissington, who had called the HQ Fighter Command at Stanmore to report the track. With fears of a surprise Soviet attack rampant, military officers immediately ordered an air defense alert. A ground-controlled interception radar at RAF Sopley began tracking unidentified aircraft moving rapidly across southwest England. Sopley's commanding officer contacted the COO at RAF Southern Sector, and orders to scramble interceptors were issued. A pair of meteors on quick reaction alert were in the sky in minutes, being vectored toward the unidentified craft by Sopley. Back at RAF Southern Sector, senior officers watched on a plot as the incoming meteors approached the unidentified craft, which suddenly accelerated to an estimated 1,000 miles per hour. The meteors throttled up as much as they could and followed the craft, but were unable to keep up. The main brace incidents would be a wake-up call to the NATO alliance and launched reinvigorated interest from the Western world in the UFO phenomenon. 2004 USS Nimitz sightings. This UFO incident would remain classified for years until footage captured by the pilots involved was leaked to the public. To the surprise of everyone, the Navy quickly admitted that the footage was not a hoax, it was genuine. The Nimitz incident would be the catalyst of a renewed interest in UFOs by the general public and herald a seismic shift amongst the highest levels of power in America over how the topic was handled. It all started on November 14, 2004, 100 miles southwest of San Diego, California. The Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was undertaking a series of drills before a pending deployment to the Persian Gulf. At 2 p.m., two F-18 Super Hornets were on a routine training flight when they got a live tasking from the USS Princeton. The Princeton had received a radar upgrade and, unbeknownst to the pilots, had been tracking mysterious objects, performing erratic maneuvers for days. The objects would descend from 80,000 feet to sea level in about a second and display incredible feats of speed and maneuverability. According to Kevin Day, Princeton's senior radar operator on the day of the incident, they had tracked over 100 unknown objects over the last 7 days, remarking that sometimes there were so many that watching them on the radar display, quote, was like watching snow fall from the sky. Now, those objects were back, and with a training flight in the air, there was a chance to finally get eyes on and figure out if the objects were real or confirm that the Princeton's very expensive new radar was a complete dud. An operations officer aboard the Princeton ordered the Super Hornets to vector in on the locations of the objects, ominously asking if the pilots were carrying any live ordnance. They were not. Arriving at the last tracked location of the objects, flight leader and squadron commander, Commander David Fravor, remarked that there was nothing to be seen until he spotted a strange disturbance in the ocean below them. Something was causing the water to churn with waves breaking over what appeared to be a very large object under the surface. Later, it would be theorized that the Super Hornets actually spotted the nuclear attack submarine that typically accompanies a U.S. carrier strike group. What got their attention next, though, was an object hovering motionless not very far away, approximately 50 feet off the water. Fravor estimated the object to be about 40 feet long, shaped like a tic-tac, and with no wings, engine, or visible means of propulsion. The object would hover still and then make erratic and sudden dashes over the ocean, reminding Fravor of throwing a ping-pong ball against the wall. Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, Fravor's wingwoman, stayed up top as Fravor descended his aircraft to get a closer look. She would later remark feeling terrified watching the craft make erratic and extremely high-G maneuvers, wondering how she'd be able to fight this thing if it turned hostile. As Fravor descended, the tic-tac seemed to take note of him and began to rise in an opposing circular swoop to Fravor, mirroring him but in reverse. Suddenly, Fravor pitched his nose toward the object in an attempt to cut it off in an aggressive maneuver. And that's when the object seemed to respond to the challenge with a game of chicken, rapidly accelerating at Fravor and flying straight across his nose. With the object gone, the operations officer on the Princeton ordered them to head to a predetermined rendezvous point 60 miles away. As they were en route, the Princeton suddenly radioed in, having picked up the tic-tac object again on its radar. To everyone's astonishment, the object was waiting for the Super Hornets right at their rendezvous point, having gotten there in less than a minute. It was almost like it was taunting them. Fravor and Dietrich were forced to return to the Nimitz, but another pair of Super Hornets would catch up to the UFO, filming the now infamous tic-tac video. Skeptics would claim that the entire USS Nimitz carrier strike group had simply misidentified a distant passenger jet, which if true would mean that the US Navy has reached Russian levels of utter incompetence. Others, like science educator and celebrity Neil deGrasse Tyson, would mock the incident, commenting on how UFOs always appear blurry, without realizing that the entire footage, including the HUD markings, are also blurry because it's been reduced in resolution, as the military typically does with footage from sensitive sensor platforms before public release. The Nimitz incident would highlight a peculiar trait of skepticism. We trust our combat aviators with the defense of $1.2 billion aircraft carriers, but not when they report anomalous craft, even if the US Navy itself supports their claim. 1973, Pascagoula Abduction, Mississippi. Alien abduction reports are not uncommon, and most have been disproven as either hoaxes or strange phenomenon such as sleep paralysis. However, one police officer's attempt to debunk a sensational abduction report would end up giving the world incredible evidence that the victims were telling the truth. On the evening of October 11, 1973, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker Jr. got off work and decided to do a bit of night fishing. The two were casting their lines when shortly after sunset they noticed a pair of blue lights flashing in the water. Looking up, they spotted a blue light about 2 to 3 miles away, moving in their direction. With shocking speed, it descended on the bayou and appeared in front of the men, coming to a stop 2 to 3 feet off the ground, about 25 yards from the stunned men. The light turned out to be coming from a large oblong-shaped craft that seemed to give off an odd whirring or whizzing sound as it moved until coming to a stop. Hickson turned to head toward the river, but before he had a chance to get very far, an opening suddenly appeared in the strange craft. 3 beings floated out of the craft toward him and Parker. The beings appeared to be wearing a skin-tight bluish suit of some kind and hovered slightly over the ground. Instead of hands, they had claw-like appendages and a bullet-shaped head with no neck that seemed to sit right atop their torso. Hickson estimated the creatures were just under 6 feet tall. The creatures did not speak, but one made a buzzing noise from time to time while the other 2 remained completely silent. Parker was terrified and at some point lost consciousness, but both he and Hickson appeared to be unable to move their bodies. 2 of the creatures floated behind Hickson and gently picked him up by his arms with their pincers, effortlessly lifting him off the ground. In a later police interview, he would claim that the creatures did not use force and he never felt a sensation of pain. They simply seemed to steer him where they wanted him to go. The creatures lifted Hickson into the craft, where he lost sight of the unconscious Parker, Inside the craft, Hickson was left floating and turned from time to time as a machine that he struggled to describe appeared to be used to inspect him. While doing his best to recall the experience, he described the machine as a giant eye with an attachment on it, and it seemed to scan his entire body. Once the apparent scan was complete, the creatures left him floating, again with no sensation of pain or discomfort. Hickson would later claim that he simply didn't feel anything except inner terror. Inside the room he was left in, there was no machinery or furniture of any kind, and the walls glowed with very bright white light. After an estimated 20 to 30 minutes, the creatures returned and laid him on his chest again. Hickson attempted to speak with the creatures, but the only response was a buzzing sound from the creature who was buzzing before. The next thing Hickson remembers is standing outside the ship with Parker, who seemed frozen in terror. The ship was gone, and Hickson struggled to get Parker to come too. The two men initially decided to keep quiet about their experience, but then Hickson suggested they call the nearby Kessler Air Force Base, who informed him to contact the sheriff. Instead, the two went to a local newspaper, but there were no reporters present, and only then they decided to head to the sheriff to report their abduction. Hickson admitted that he didn't expect to be believed, but he still felt like he had to tell the authorities. The sheriff conducted a brief interview, but was convinced the men were lying. To prove they were lying, he left the hidden tape recorder running and left the interrogation room for a few minutes, hoping to catch the two in the act of discussing their hoax. Instead, he captured more proof that, if anything, the two men believed they'd really been abducted. The tape recorder captured the two men in a state of panic. Parker stated that he had to get home or see a doctor to help him calm down, and Hickson stated that he needed a drink to calm his own nerves. Parker had passed out from terror and admitted as such. Thus, his recollection was not as detailed as Hickson's, but he did comment about the initial paralyzation effect and being unable to move. The men discussed the door opening on the side of the ship and the creatures coming out of it. Hickson warned that nobody would believe them, then stated, quote, "They won't believe it. They're gonna believe it one of these days. Might be too late. I knew all along there was people from other worlds up there. I knew all along. I never thought it would happen to me." Hickson became agitated at this point, stating he needed to get home and get himself a stiff drink to help him sleep. He left the room, and the last thing the tape recorder captured before the sheriff returned was Parker alone in the room stating, quote, "It's hard to believe. Oh God, it's awful. I know there's a God up there." And then Parker began praying in a low tone. There were no other witnesses to the Pascagoula abduction, and Hickson refused to take a polygraph test concerning the event. Hickson's initial story also changed some of the details over time, whether due to embellishments or memory remains unknown. One skeptic would claim that Hickson had fantasized the entire encounter during a waking dream state, with Parker going along with it due to suggestibility caused by his loss of consciousness. Hickson would go on to tell his own story on 4 TV programs, and both would conduct various interviews. Years later, Parker would start a TV production company to produce shows related to UFOs and released a book late in his life recounting his abduction. The two men have given considerable fodder for skeptics to tear holes in their story, but nobody has yet to account for the behavior of the men when they were not aware that they were being recorded. The original secret recording was meant to bust the hoax wide open and instead showed two men desperately terrified and in a near state of panic. Then, 45 years after the event, another witness came forward, told by her family to remain quiet for decades so as to not draw attention to herself. Maria Blair decided to come forward to help corroborate the men's story at last. On that same night, Blair had driven her husband to the bayou so he could take a boat to work offshore. As the two waited for the captain in their parked car, her husband went to sleep. Shortly after dark, Blair spotted a blue light lifting up off the ground on the opposite riverbank and heading straight up into the sky. Blair didn't think much of the incident until the next day when news of the abduction broke, and she realized she'd witnessed the craft after it had taken the men. She wanted to come forward, but her husband warned her for years after the event not to speak of a word of it to anyone, as she would be ridiculed for it. Blair could have simply been latching onto the case after the fact, with her husband playing a supporting role. Ultimately, the truth of what really happened that night is unknown. All we know is that a secret tape recording collected strong proof that whatever happened, Hickson and Parker at least believed they had been abducted by aliens. 1967, Falcon Lake Incident, Canada. While Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker only have a story and a compelling secret recording to back their claims, one UFO encounter left physical evidence of its existence, seared onto the flesh of its victim. It would come to be known as one of Canada's biggest UFO cases, so big in fact that it was investigated by agencies on both sides of the border. The victim, Stephen McCalloch, would go on to wish he'd never spoken about the incident, even as it forced him to seek treatment at the world-renowned Mayo Clinic for the mysterious lasting effects. It all began on May 20, 1967, with McCalloch, a former military policeman in the Polish military, venturing in the wilderness of Falcon Lake. An amateur geologist, McCalloch liked to prospect for quartz and silver and had staked a few claims in the area. On this long weekend, he set out to look for where he might stake more claims and do a bit of exploring. At some point during his hike, the 51-year-old McCalloch was startled by a flight of geese erupting in honks. Looking up to see what had startled the birds, McCalloch spotted two cigar-shaped objects with a reddish glow hovering just 45 meters away. As he watched, one of the objects descended onto a large, flat outcropping of rock, changing its shape to appear more disc-like as it did. The other remained hovering in the air above it for a few minutes and then left. McCalloch immediately assumed he'd stumbled across secret U.S. test aircraft. He sat on a rock for the next 30 minutes and sketched what he saw. After finishing his sketch, he decided to approach the craft, wondering if perhaps the pilots had experienced some kind of trouble and might need help. As he approached, the air grew very warm and the craft seemed to give off a strong smell of sulfur. Unlike other UFO encounters, McCalloch reported hearing a sound like whirring motors and the hiss of air, prompting him to believe he was indeed looking at a secret U.S. aircraft and not an alien one. Getting closer, he noticed an open door on the side of the craft with very bright lights inside. He also heard multiple voices speaking inside the craft, but the noise of it muffled the conversation and made it impossible to make out the details. McCalloch then called to the craft, offering the quote Yankee boys help if they needed any. The voices immediately went quiet, but did not respond. He then tried Polish, Russian, and finally German, but nobody responded. At this point, McCalloch drew closer and noticed that the metal of the craft appeared perfectly smooth, with no seams, joints, or connecting bolts of any kind visible. He was forced to put on the welding goggles that he used to protect his eyes while chipping rocks, so he could look inside through the bright light coming out. Inside, he saw various light beams and panels of flashing lights, but couldn't see anyone inside the strange craft. Suddenly, as McCalloch took a step back, 3 panels slid across the opening and sealed it. Reaching out to touch the craft, the moment he made contact with the metal, the heat of the craft melted the fingertips of his leather glove. Then the craft began to slowly turn counterclockwise until a panel with a grid of holes was aimed directly at him. A blast of superheated gas struck McCalloch and knocked him over, setting his shirt and cap on fire and forcing him to tear them off. The craft then lifted off and flew away. Nauseous and disoriented, the shirtless McCalloch stumbled his way out of the forest and to his hotel room. Then he took a bus and caught a ride back to Winnipeg, where he was treated for burns on his chest and stomach. The burns would turn into raised sores in a perfect grid-like pattern, as described on the craft by McCalloch. As McCalloch's story spread, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the U.S. Air Force, and various other government agencies launched an investigation. Investigators backtracked McCalloch's journey and found the site of the incident, where they recovered the melted glove he had torn off his hand, as well as his burned shirt and the tools he left behind. Later analysis of the burns would frustrate those trying to identify what could have caused the grid-like pattern. Also at the site was a 15-foot diameter circle that had been cleared completely of moss and other vegetation. Soil samples from the circle as well as McCalloch's clothing were tested and discovered to be radioactive. A year later, another investigation discovered bits of metal which appeared to have been melted into the cracks between rocks in the alleged landing site. When tested, this metal too was found to be radioactive and remains so to this day. McCalloch himself would remain sick after the event, with the burns recurring on his chest up to a year after the incident. Suffering from nausea and blackouts, McCalloch was referred to the Mayo Clinic, with doctors unable to diagnose his illness. A psychiatrist that analyzed McCalloch, though, found him to be very down-to-earth and unlikely to invent wild fantasies. The incident has never been explained, though the initial investigation by the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book found it inconclusive. Investigators from Project Blue Book noted that McCalloch was unable to guide them back to the site of the incident, with one suspecting that he was stalling on purpose. However, an air search was able to locate the alleged landing site, and there was never an explanation given for the 15-foot burned circle of vegetation, nor the superheated metal discovered a year later wedged into cracks in the rocks. Investigators were unable to explain the source of McCalloch's burns on his body, clothing, and melted glove. The radioactivity measured, though, was believed to have come from a nearby radium vein that was discovered near the site. Skeptics would point to McCalloch's claims of not having anything to drink being disputed by a bartender at the hotel that he was staying at, who stated that Michalek had drank 5 bottles of beer the night before. Michalek also differed on his take on the conversation he had with the police officer, G.A. Solotki, with Solotki noting the differences in his own report, as well as the burns on Michalek's body and possible inebriation. Skeptics would also claim that Michalek had likely made up the entire event to dissuade others from exploring any of his mining claims. However, beer does not stay in your system for nearly 24 hours, and none of the search parties found any evidence of heavy drinking by Michalek in the area. Further, there was no evidence of any sort of fire that Michalek might have had a drunk accident with, only to blame it on a UFO, as skeptics claim. The suspicion of being inebriated was likely simply due to the very nauseous state, physical exhaustion, and the pain that Michalek was in, as verified by the hospital staff who treated him. Further, skeptics claim that Michalek's recurring grid-like burn marks were caused by an allergic reaction, despite Michalek having never such a reaction before or again in his life after the final appearance of the burns a year later. Michalek's own family attests that he has never suffered any similar allergic reaction before. No explanation for the molten metal or the 15-foot circle of burned vegetation has been offered. Now go check out Soviet declassified UFO encounters revealed, or click this other video instead.